Okay, welcome everyone to August 2022 Aerobridge webinar. If you are new to Aerobridge, Aerobridge is a open source community and a drone manufacturing and trusted flights operations management server. And today I'm going to talk about some of the new things that are in Aerobridge that relate to drone assembly and manufacturing. Again, everything that you're going to see is open source, and the way to join this community is by joining Aerobridge. If you go to aerobridge.io, there is a request for a Slack, and that's the way to join. This is part of a series of webinars that we conduct, and essentially, if you go to the YouTube page of Open Skies, which maintains Aerobridge, you will see the past webinars as well. My name is Rishi. I'm the founder and the lead developer of Aerobridge, and today I'm going to walk you through some of these features that are there. And if this is the first time that you're listening to an Aerobridge webinar, don't worry, I'll just give you a brief overview, and then we'll jump right into the main things that we're going to discuss today around assembly and supply chain management. So let's begin. Just to sort of set the scene, I wanted to cover the things that Open Skies, the company, does. So Open Skies is a company that has founded Aerobridge. This is the picture essentially of drone operations. Some of you may recognize via the news or others what are the things that you can do with the drone. And obviously there is an operator and a drone manufacturer as well, and they have to work for some company and they do these operations. Now, as far as Open Skies is concerned, there are two products that we really work on and build. One is Aerobridge, which we will talk about today, which provides solutions for operators and manufacturers around design and manufacturing, supply chain management, components tracking that we'll talk about, and an important part called trusted flights. So all of these things are available for operators and manufacturers, and they will help you with compliance, with having a modern supply chain, and modern operations, flight operations stack. And you will see some of this shortly. The other part is the UTM part, which we won't talk about too much, but there are products called Flight Spotlight and Flight Blender, which are open source UTM products, basically compatible with the UTM standards that are coming. We can leave it for some other time, but essentially, these are the two sort of main products and tooling that Aerobridge is associated with, Open Skies is associated with, and then we'll talk about Aerobridge particularly. Now, Aerobridge can be accessed via aerobridge.io. If you are not familiar, you just go to the website and you can see, for example, some of the tools here that are there. This is the website. And essentially, it provides three things: Aerobridge Server, which is what we were going to see now, which helps you with supply chain management and flight operations, trusted flights, and so on, log storage, and the likes. Then we have a connection with the vehicle via Aerobridge Mavlink. Mavlink provides interfaces to custom flight controllers, custom versions of open source flight controllers like Arduino and PX4, so that the management server can talk to the vehicle. And then we have an open hardware stack called Aerobridge F1, which is used throughout this, which we will talk about as well. Before we continue, I'm just going to switch my sharing so that I can share my entire screen. And you will see some of these as I change the windows. Now, let's talk about what Aerobridge enables you to do. So in addition to the supply chain and the hardware operations management piece we will talk about, one of the key components of Aerobridge is what is known as trusted flights. And what does that mean? It gives hardware manufacturers and operators control over what software can be run or cannot be run on the vehicle. So essentially, hardware and software is not only secured for its owner, but against its owner as well. So this is in a simple way, a permissioning system where it is deployed inside your company as a manufacturer or an operator, and then you can issue permissions, maintain records, and so on. And so what this solves for you is this question of who is flying the drone. So maybe you can have some people who have logins with your company via Active Directory or OpenID or something like that. where is the drone made is what we're going to talk about, which is can we trace the drone components and so on. So you're going to see solutions for that. And then can you trust the code and the technology in the drone operations? This is the essence of trusted flight. You can look at the past webinars on how we have these token permissioning system and so on. As I said, today we are going to talk about where the drone is made and the manufacturing and the supply chain side of things. And this is the stack essentially that Aerobridge works on. Essentially, we have custom versions of Autopilot. PX4 is in the works. We have sort of connections to the vehicle via Mavlink itself or via a custom version of QGCS. It depends on what you're trying to do, but basically they're communicating to the vehicle and the flight controller via Mavlink, and then a link to the management server for these vehicles as well. So you can think of Aerobridge as helping you with fleet management, trusted flights, identity, and supply chain and manufacturing and so on. So it's all in one kind of a server that then connects to the rest of the stack. And then, of course, Aerobridge can connect to the UTM, Blender, and so on that we can talk about some other time. Now, as a part of Aerobridge, we have what is known as Aerobridge F1, which is our reference design of a quadcopter. And this is what we would call as a small, open small UAS architecture program. Essentially, we have provided a reference design for a drone. So if you want to get started in building a quadcopter, you can start to look at Aerobridge F1. So if I just switch my screen now and go to the Flyer 1, basically here you will see some computations on performance. Here you can see the components of a very basic quadcopter, and then some videos and so on of how to assemble it. So this is part of the small UAS program. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to open up the drone design and some components in supply chain. There are some interesting things that we're working on in this context. But the idea here is for you to get started with a small quadcopter drone. If you look at the components, we have 13 of them. Nothing too special or complicated. If you're familiar with drones, you should be able to recognize some of these parts, the F450 frame, the speed controllers, the propellers, and so on. And so essentially what we're saying is with this drone, if you assemble it, you should be able to have a flight time of 15 minutes and do some very basic mapping activity in it. And of course, the software associated with it, which is the trusted flights and so on, comes along with it. So that's the website. We can take a look. I'll just leave it here for a minute, and then we will continue with our manufacturing and supply chain. Right. So manufacturing and supply chain of drones and assembly of drones is really targeted towards this kind of manufacturing. So we are talking about small to medium-sized manufacturers. They are operators and manufacturers themselves. Sometimes there are dedicated manufacturers and so on. And the real problem that we're going to solve for manufacturers and operators, or assemblers, I should say, is this notion of inventory and complex supply chain management, component organization and sort of verified components, and then supplier management. So if you are an assembler or a small manufacturer of drones, large as well, by the way, but it's software, so it can scale in any way. But the idea is that Aerobridge, the manufacturing and supply chain component of Aerobridge, can help you with inventory, BOM management, and so on. And we're going to see some of this very shortly. Just to sort of talk about, if you aren't familiar, or if you are familiar with what goes on in a small assembler or a small manufacturer, basically, supply chain management is very primitive. You are dealing with Excel, parts that break, parts and repairs that are done on the fly. Essentially, there is an issue with sort of this BOM management, parts management, and supply chain management for small manufacturers. And all of the software that is out there for supply chain and so on and parts management is not customized for the drone industry. So what Aerobridge provides you, in addition to trusted flights, it provides you with a very specific sort of component management solution for drone assembly and manufacturing. And so what you will see here is basically a manufacturing and assembly-oriented product that is built specifically for the drone industry by the community. So let's just take a look at it. Just to sort of, for the sake of record, if I go to Aerobridge IO, everything that I'm going to show you is available in our test flight server. So test flight is the sort of the bleeding edge, latest and greatest deployments that we have on the code base. All of this is available on GitHub, but so don't be surprised if something crashes or breaks, because this is our test flight server. So if I go here, you will see basically the Aerobridge Launchpad. Now, if you remember, we had this sort of a model with 13 components. And so pretend that you are a manufacturer or an assembler of drone vehicles. So here, if I go to manufacturing and I go to models and assemblies, you will see I have my Aerobridge F1 Series 2022.1. Now, of course, all of this can be customized for your drone, your sort of vehicle, and so on. But for the moment, we are using, as I said, the F1 as a reference design for all of this to help us get started. So here is the F1. What is it? Well, it's the name, series popular name. Notice we have a firmware associated with it. So the vehicle design is linked to a firmware. So this is where the power of the management server comes into play. You can link actual software with the vehicle. And then this is the blueprint, meaning what goes in this drone. So here you have battery charger, and so on. So which is basically the bill of materials for this one. Each and every one of them can have suppliers and manufacturers and so on. So if I go to my operations and see my companies, here you will see I have one supplier for the sake of our demonstration, and then one manufacturer, Nile Robotics, and they manufacture 14 parts. So all of a sudden you can manage who is supplying components to you, who is actually manufacturing it. Maybe the supplier is just reselling it or something like that. And then you also have yourself, which is the assembler in this case, and then some operators. So you can start to see how your supply chain is laid out. This is flexible in the sense that you can choose to fill out everything or not. But the idea here is now all of a sudden you have a very good supplier management platform for it. So let's go back to models and assemblies. I have this model, and this is my sort of all the details about this. What I can now start to do is I can start to do some assembly work. So here I have completed, for example, built 2 F1 drones. And so here is the details, aircraft assembly details. So here you can see now the assembly is complete. It is this one, it has a unique ID. And then these are the 14 components which were procured from, let's say, Aerial Robot. So now you can start to say, well, I procured this component, have an invoice with it, or some sort of a billing sort of system, and then I have installed it on the drone itself. So now here you have the assembled components. Of course, there is a charger, but you don't install it on the drone. So you have this flexibility of components that are associated with the drone, but not part of the charger of the assembly. So essentially what we have here is 2 aircraft that I have assembled. This is the number 1, and this is the other sort of a drone. And then I can have in my trusted flights and aircraft these linked, right? So F1 number 1 and F1 number 2. So if I go over here, you can see here the drone status is active. It is used by Aerobridge August Photography, for example. It could be any company that you have. I have a friendly name, which is my number 1 F1. Linking the flight controller ID in the management server. So you're saying this drone has this software and this flight controller. So you can start to control this when it comes to trusted flights. You should look at the trusted flights demos that are there in the playlist for that. But then you also have these details of assembly and so on. Now, one of the things that I wanted to show you today was basically this components management in an assembly. Essentially, as you know, when you conduct flights, accidents happen, components break during landing, during something happened, and so you have to break the component, sort of damage happens, you take it out, maybe buy a new component from your website, whoever your supplier is, and then fix it. So let's see how that works in an Aerobridge kind of a context. Now imagine if you don't have Aerobridge, then you're basically doing it on Excel and sort of talking to people and your colleagues. So here in the aircraft section, let's say I have an F1 flight, number 2 flight here, and during a landing, my landing gear, or let's say the frame, got damaged. Let's say that happened for whatever reason, maybe it was too windy, something like that. So here against the drone, I have a report an incident button. So if I say click here, here you see I have reporting an incident against the F1 number 2 drone. So I have 2 drones. So this is the second one. And here is the impacted component. So here you can say my frame, for example, has been impacted. So this is all the components in there. And then I say, during landing, the frame hit the ground too hard and got damage, right? And then you're saying, well, what happened to it? Well, it could be damaged, it could be destroyed, it could be something that's a quarantine or something like that. You might need to look at it, but it's not really destroyed or something like that. In this case, it was destroyed, and then I'm going to add an incident. Now we have this, of course, an incident list, which is essentially during landing, the frame got reported. So what you can also do now is essentially do a bunch of things with this. Once you have reported an incident, you can, of course, have notes, but also you can have flight logs, for example, associated with this incident. And so you can start to see how some of this becomes very powerful in your operations. But let's just take a look at the aircraft now. Look what happened. Number two, because the component was destroyed, the status is disabled. Now, what that means is that because you're reporting that something has broken down, you cannot fly the drone at all. So let's take a look at what's going on in the assembly. So here you can see in my assembly, I have noted that that component is destroyed. So that's why we have to sort of remove that from our assembly. So if I go over here, you can see here that this is my frame. Here is the master component, so the blueprint of that. And then I'm going to say remove this from assembly. So aircraft component is removed from assembly. So if I go back to my assembly, see here now, the parts are needed. So we have removed something from our assembly. Now it's saying you cannot fly because this assembly is incomplete. So I go back to my assembly details. If you look at it, here you will see that this is components that should be in the drone, but it is not. So if you remember, I had removed this thing from the assembly. So let's take a look at it. Okay, you know that you have a supplier. You have one that's on the number one drone, that's okay, and one that's destroyed. So we can sort of start to see the online ordering. So you can imagine like a buy now button or something like that in this. But let's say I have received a new one. So now the frame got destroyed. We ordered a new frame from our supplier, Nile Robotics, and now I have received it. So let's acknowledge custody of that one. So I say here, that's the frame. If you have invoices or something like that that you want to link with this, you can do that. And then you say, this is X 2.3. That's my internal naming scheme. New frame, August 2022, something like that. And then I say add a component. This is the issue with the bleeding edge components, but let's say this is sort of the new frame. And then what you can start to do is go back to your assembly and then see essentially what components are available here. So here, if we didn't have that error, you would have seen the components we just ordered in there, and then the aircraft assembly is updated. Basically, what's going on is that you are maintaining a record of what happens to your vehicle. And additionally, you can do this sort of linking flight logs and documents with your management server. And this becomes your system of record as far as assembly operations and manufacturing operations are concerned. Now, the other thing that is interesting that I wanted to sort of share with you in this case is that we have, for example, two aircraft, number one and number two. Here you see essentially there is a landing gear and there is this concept called Aerobridge ID. So essentially, this is a simple ID that you can configure within your company. So this is in English, so you can have any other French words, Hindi words, or any other words that you may have, any other language, frankly, you may have. And what it is doing is generating a global ID for your components. So if you look at essentially all the components that are there, every component that will have an Aerobridge ID. So boat house elevate route is one ID. I can go to the verify components page of Aerobridge, and then I can start to query the status of components. So every time you acknowledge custody of a component, it gives you kind of a unique Aerobridge ID that you can configure. So this is just a sample, but essentially you can say, I have this component is verified. And essentially what you are now doing is then have this component history associated with this part as well, right? So you can start to really develop very sophisticated tracking of what's happening with your components as well. So this function will be developed quite a bit in the coming days. We'll have much more detailed timelines and so on. But the idea here is that you will be able to track the components throughout their life cycle. And essentially, all of this is available on the test flight server. As I said, it keeps changing every time we do something, and there's a new build and so on. But you can start to see all of this essentially in the test flight. So I would encourage you to take a look at it. So why is all this useful? Let's talk about that. Basically, if you're doing drone assembly and drone manufacturing, a huge problem at the moment is tracing and tracking and sort of understanding where some of these technologies come from. Drone technology, depending on where you're flying, can be very sensitive. And using these kind of tools and trusted flights, you can start to build a systematic and a professional operations framework for your company. And obviously, Aerobridge provides the full stack, the management server, the reference hardware, and the supply chain tracking and sort of all of that associated with it. With that, we conclude. I just wanted to give you 30 minutes of your time to share with you the latest in Aerobridge. All of this, again, is available on aerobridge.io. And the best thing to do is to go to the website and join our Slack community. This keeps sort of being updated and changed as time progresses. But the idea here is that we are building the trusted flight components, and now, as I shared with you, the component management aspect of all of this as well. With this, I conclude. Thank you so much, and we will take questions. I'm going to stop the recording, and I'll talk to you in the next webinar. Thank you.